Welcome to the deep dive, where we try to, dissect these complex topics and really get to those core insights. Today, we're plunging into, well, an economic puzzle that actually hits pretty close to home right in your medicine cabinet. We're asking why generic drug manufacturers aren't exactly rushing to build plants here in the US. I mean, you hear all these calls for more domestic production, right? Seems like a clear need. But the market seems to be telling a very, very different story.
It really is. It's a classic economic dilemma playing out right now. It really showcases that relentless pursuit of profit maximization, and in one of the most vital sectors we have, but also one of the most challenging. So for you as an economics student, this deep dive, I think, will really show how those fundamental theories, market structure, incentives, risk assessment, how they're right at the heart of this very real, sometimes frustrating supply chain issue.
Okay, so let's try and unravel this paradox then. Because on one hand, you've got the big brand name drug makers, the likes of Bristol Myers Squibb, Eli Lilly, Roche. They're pledging literally billions. I think the figure was over $250 billion. Huge investments in U.S. manufacturing. Sounds like a massive vote of confidence, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yet the generic drug makers, the ones making, what, 90% of America's prescriptions?
That's the staggering number, yes.
Yeah.
90%.
They're largely, it seems, resisting any similar kind of commitment. So what on earth explains that? Such a stark difference in how they're deciding to invest, especially when, both types of companies are ultimately driven by profit.
Right, and that's the key. The crucial difference is really in their market dynamics. And consequently, their profit maximization strategies. They're just playing different games. The generic drug business, it's often described as low margin and unpredictable. And that description is absolutely critical if you want to understand their behavior. If you look at the actual numbers, generic drug makers average a net profit margin of about, say, 18.1%. Now, you contrast that with the brand name guys. Research, I think, from USC's Schaefer Institute puts them significantly higher, around 28.1%.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is. And what that stark contrast tells you immediately is that these generic companies, they're operating with way less financial flexibility. They have a much, much tighter window for making a profit.
Yeah.
So naturally, every single decision, especially these huge long-term capital investments like building a plant, gets scrutinized through an incredibly tight profit lens.
So it's not just less wiggle room. It's, like you said, a completely different game. And we know they compete mostly on price, right, and make money on volume. So from that profit maximization angle, how does that sort of race to the bottom on price shape their day-to-day calls? And more importantly, their willingness to drop billions on new U.S. facilities. It sounds like a really unforgiving market space.
Oh, it truly is. It's incredibly tough. That environment means every single penny saved on making the drug. And every penny they can squeeze out in sales directly impacts whether they can stay afloat and, hit their profit targets. The prices for their drugs, we're talking common antibiotics, essential statins, things people rely on have just fallen so low. It makes it incredibly difficult for U.S.-based manufacturers to even compete on cost.
Right.
And it's not just like general market forces doing this. The situation is definitely made worse by the huge buyer power that these big intermediaries have.
You mean the PBMs and GPOs?
Exactly. The pharmacy benefit managers, the PBMs, and the group purchasing organizations, the GPOs. Act almost like an oligopsony, A few really dominant buyers negotiating for employers, for hospitals, and they are constantly pushing down the prices that generic makers can charge.
So they're getting squeezed from that side, too.
Absolutely squeezed. And, to really get how absurd the pricing can get, listen to this quote from the CEO of Sandoz, a major generic player. He actually said, and I'm quoting here, "You sell a packet of antibiotics more cheaply than a packet of M&Ms. That's offensive, and we lose money doing that."
Cheaper than M&Ms. Wow.
Yeah. So when your revenue stream is under that kind of constant aggressive downward pressure, just achieving sustainable profit is hard enough, let alone trying to justify these massive investments in higher cost places like the U.S. It becomes an extraordinarily difficult case to make. It's basically a direct disincentive to profit maximization if you're looking at a high-cost manufacturing environment.
That quote really does hit home, the M&M comparison. Okay, so given these already razor-thin margins, this intense price competition, how does something like, say, the threat of potential tariffs from a U.S. government investigation factor in? Like that Section 232 investigation under the Trump administration looking into imported medicines. Seems like adding another layer of cost, another layer of uncertainty would be the absolute last thing these companies need.
Exactly. And this brings up that really important point about how policy uncertainty and just the perception of risk directly hits a company's profit calculation. So the Section 232 investigation, just for context, it's a national security thing.
Right.
It lets the government put tariffs on imports if they think there's a threat.
Okay.
So the possibility of these tariffs, it just introduces this massive unknown into their cost structures. You just don't know what's coming. You see companies like Teva, huge player, provides like 1 out of every 14 generic prescriptions in the U.S. They're explicitly saying, look, we need to wait and see what happens with these policies before we even think about more U.S. investment.
So they're just pausing any plans?
Pretty much.
Hmm.
And actually, Teva even warned that tariffs could make it less attractive to keep their existing U.S. production going. They suggested it might become more cost-efficient for them to just consolidate everything overseas.
Wow, so it could backfire.
Potentially, yes. I mean, think about it from their perspective. If the cost of operating here goes up, maybe tariffs on raw materials they import, or even on finished drugs, they might export those already slim profit margins could just disappear. Experts and the manufacturers themselves, they warn that if tariffs cut into profits too much, companies might just stop selling certain drugs here altogether.
Just pull them from the market.
Rather than risk losing money continuously on them, yes. That's a direct, if maybe harsh, profit-maximizing decision, right? If production isn't profitable, you stop producing. Even if, unfortunately, that makes existing drug shortages even worse for patients.
It's a really stark reminder, isn't it? That even with critical stuff like medicine, businesses ultimately have to run on economic viability. Okay, so if tariffs and pressure aren't the answer, what would it actually take? What incentives would make these generic drug makers want to invest in U.S. manufacturing? We heard Sandoz, for example, they don't make any drugs in the U.S. right now. Basically say, sticks are not going to incentivize me to build an antibiotics facility, especially one costing, what, $2 or $3 billion? And one they think would probably run at a loss anyway in the current market.
Right, and what often gets missed in the public discussion is this very clear, almost unified call from the industry for carrots, not sticks.
Yeah.
Generic drug makers, their trade groups, they're not really looking for, appeals to patriotism. They're looking for solid economic reasons to invest here. They're pushing for actual concrete measures that would bring some stability and fundamentally improve the profit outlook in the U.S. market.
Like what kind of measures? What are the carrots they're asking for?
Well, it's about direct policy tools that actually shift their cost and revenue curves in a favorable way. Things like government-backed financing, maybe direct grant money for construction, that would directly lower their huge initial fixed costs.
Okay, help with the upfront investment.
Exactly. Or another big one, increased reimbursement rates for drugs sold through government insurance, like Medicare or Medicaid. That effectively boosts their revenue per unit sold.
Right, helps on the revenue side.
And maybe the most critical piece, long-term contracts where the government guarantees it will purchase certain amounts of medication. These procurement contracts are vital. They reduce that demand uncertainty. They provide predictable revenue streams, which is absolutely crucial if you're trying to justify making these enormous multi-year capital investments in a factory.
Gives them some security.
Precisely. Remember, companies moved operations overseas largely because of factors like cheaper labor, subsidies from other governments, maybe looser regulations, all things that directly improve their cost structure and therefore their profit potential. So for them to reverse that trend, the U.S. market needs to offer similarly compelling profit incentives. It's basic economics for them.
So it really boils down to making the U.S. a genuinely more economically attractive place for this specific type of manufacturing, not just, putting up barriers to imports and hoping they'll just come back. We have seen a couple of exceptions, haven't we? Like Hikma, based in London, buying that Ohio plant for sterile injectables, and Amneal Pharmaceuticals, too.
Yeah, there are a few outliers.
But they do seem to be outliers among the really big generic companies, which suggests those underlying economic disincentives are still incredibly powerful for most of them.
It's exactly right. And those big investments we mentioned earlier from the brand name companies, while they're significant, they often focus on, new, very expensive medicines that were probably already made in America anyway, like cell therapies, complex biologic cancer drugs, stuff that accounts for, I think, over 80% of the country's total drug spending. They're making a totally different kind of profit calculation.
A different market segment altogether.
Completely. So if we connect this back to the bigger picture, the challenge isn't just about getting any drug production back on shore. It's specifically about tackling shortages of those essential everyday generic drugs. The antibiotics, the statins, which are overwhelmingly made overseas right now. And this raises, I think, an important question for you, the listener. How can economic policy really move the needle on the availability of those critical everyday medications if the fundamental profit incentives just aren't aligned for the generic manufacturers who make them?
It's a really complex balancing act, isn't it, between, say, national security goals and the hard realities of a globalized, profit-driven industry. Okay, so wrapping this up, what does this all really mean for how we should understand the global pharmaceutical scene and especially the vital role generic drugs play? We've clearly seen how these decisions by generic drug makers, they're deeply rooted in those fundamental economic principles we talked about, profit maximization, driven by those incredibly tight margins, fierce price competition, and also the perceived risks from policy shifts like tariffs. They seem to be signaling pretty clearly that they need stability and they need those financial carrots to justify making the huge investments needed for more U.S. manufacturing.
Yeah, and this whole discussion really throws a spotlight on that inherent tension, doesn't it? The tension between what a nation might want strategically, like ensuring a secure supply of essential medicines, and the profit-driven realities of how a globalized industry actually operates. So, for you as an economics student, maybe the key takeaway, the question to really wrestle with is this. How can government policy effectively bridge that gap, the gap between national interests like health security and the profit-maximizing decisions businesses have to make in a global market, especially when you're dealing with an industry like generics, low margin, high volume? What mix of those economic carrots, what kind of stable policy environment could genuinely shift the math for these companies? How do you ensure both their economic viability and our public health security? It's definitely a puzzle that needs some creative economic thinking, well beyond just the basics of supply and demand.